Okay, so yeah, good evening, everyone. And we are finally at the last session of the webinar series. This evening, Leah, again, is going to explain to us how to deliver the training modules of the UPR. The training modules are a fundamental part of the model because they allow the participants to really understand how to take part in the model and how to prepare themselves and to prepare their work. And I saw there's also a few members of the secretariat joining us, so that's great. And yeah, so Leah, go ahead, I'll leave you the floor.
Thank you so much, Sophia. I'm just going to share my screen and I hope this is going to be visible. Perfect. Can I just confirm, please, if my slides are visible? Excellent.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sophia. So as Sophia has very warmly said, hello and welcome to what is our final webinar of the series. And today's session will look exclusively at how we design and deliver the training component of the Padova Model UPR. And today I'm going to try to use a mixture of I suppose, information being delivered. So we will look at essentially how we design the training, how we deliver the training, but equally trying to use some examples from previous year's training sessions to help with the visualization, I suppose, of the content that I will be covering today. And just because I feel it's tradition now, a reminder that we do have the applications open for this year's Padova Model UPR process. The deadline is the 6th of October. And we welcome applications as teams. And once again, just to say that if you have any questions or queries about the application process or indeed the simulation overall, please do contact this year's secretariat. The email address is at the bottom of the slides. So today will be broken into two parts, as always, and firstly looking at designing the training modules and the, I suppose, core topics within that part. We really will look at what are the aims and objectives of the training program, as well as how we design those training sessions. And then part two, looking exclusively at delivery, and firstly looking at what we mean by training delivery, as I think that really underlines the training program as part of the overall simulation. Then looking at how exactly the training program is delivered to our participants and what structure does that happen in. So in terms then of starting from the beginning, for me, I think this point cannot be emphasized enough. When designing the training component of, I suppose, any program, but very also specifically the Padova Model UPR, we must always consider what the aims and objectives of the training are. And then, I suppose, arising from that, how do those aims and objectives connect with the undertaking of the simulation? So by that, I mean, the training program isn't just something that's delivered to have some academic or theoretical component of the Padova Model UPR. It's not about covering an international human rights law module in a couple of weeks before the simulation take place in Padova in November. It's much more direct and specific than that. The design of the training program is undertaken in such a way that we want to ensure our participants are as prepared for undertaking their roles, engaging in the game, engaging with other teams, and thereby not just undertaking the simulation, but understanding where that simulation comes from, understanding its relevancy in the context of the UPR as an international human rights mechanism itself. So this isn't being conducted in isolation. It's not something that's taken upon by the Secretariat as a means of topping up academic classroom-based discussion and learning. It's a fundamental component, as Sophia had said at the beginning of this webinar, to the Padova Model UPR, whereby we're ensuring our participants will have the skills and the capabilities to engage fully with the simulation when it takes place in November. And then arising from that, it's the time frame and duration of the programme as well. So what I mean by that is we purposely hold the training programme shortly before the simulation takes place, a number of weeks. The dates can change slightly each edition, which is why I'm just saying a number of weeks. But the training programme is held at that time frame to ensure there is space for participants to be immersed in this component of the programme, to have the time that they need to understand each respective part of the training, to ask questions if need be to the secretariat broadly or their instructors more specifically, and also to engage within their own team setting and with other teams in advance of the simulation. And that is very important. This type of training programme cannot be delivered 1 or 2 weeks before the simulation. It traditionally does take place perhaps sometimes nearly a month before the simulation. And that's, as I said, just to emphasise, to ensure our participants have the time to engage in the training during the sessions, but also after the sessions, and that they have the time that they need to go over the resources provided to them, to ensure that they understand what their roles and responsibilities will be, what their assignments will be, and to have the time to ask questions. And that hopefully can reduce or prevent any confusion and queries arising on site at the time of the simulation, so participants can be confident and comfortable engaging with their teams and other teams on site in November. And I will speak on it later on in more detail, but the training programme's specific duration, we usually only need 3 days over 3 weeks. And that is also part of our broader, I suppose, intense immersive programme. But also we are cognizant that our participants will be students, that they will have at this time of year their own university commitments to undertake, possibly other commitments like employment commitments. So we don't want our participants to feel they must attend our training sessions every day for 1 week, or 3 days of 2 weeks and 3 days of another week. It's really designed that we can be in a space with them. We can deliver the key components of each session to them in that space, that they can then have that self-direct research and self-learning components I had spoken about last week, but also they have time to engage with the secretariat where needed, whilst balancing their other responsibilities so they don't become, too much under pressure. And also arising from that sense of the broader aims and objectives, the training programme in its design and delivery is very heavily based on the structure of the Padova Model UPR handbook. And essentially, as I have here in the slide, the handbook really should be the blueprint for the design and delivery of the training modules. And in so doing, we will make constant reference and use of the handbook in the sessions themselves, whether it's direct specific citations or references, or just constantly reminding participants that the handbook is their guide for the simulation. And that again is to ensure that they feel that they have the tools and the understanding necessary to become as involved in the simulation as possible, but again, they feel comfortable and confident in doing so. And another key part of, I suppose, the broader understanding of how we design the training component is the use of online delivery. So whilst the simulation itself, bar those years of the pandemic, the simulation itself will take place on site in Padova. The training programme is delivered in an online format, and that essentially is to do with how we structure the wider programme around other commitments and responsibilities of the Secretariat, of staff at the Human Rights Centre, and of our participants themselves. It's much easier, and I would argue more effective, to have the online delivery format being, understanding of participants' own university schedules and commitments, than requiring them to come to Padova for 2 weeks and then to leave and then to come back again for another 2 weeks. So we're also trying to ensure cost effectiveness and affordability. And affordability is not just also in cost, it's in time as well. And it's really important for us that as many participants attend the training component is compulsory. But with every edition, there may be issues arising, which could mean that some participants can't attend all of the training sessions. And when you conduct training online, firstly, it can mean people who otherwise might not be able to attend in-person trainings can do so. It also means we can record our training sessions, and then participants, including those who could not attend the live session, will have access to that material. And again, through self-learning and self-directed study, can gain the understanding and the knowledge that they require to help to firstly conclude the training program for themselves, but then be prepared to undertake a simulation. And that's why I finish on this point around how do we then ensure that we can really engage our participants within the training program. If we recognise how important the training is to the simulation, that therefore means when we design the training and we deliver the training, we must always be focused on the broader aims and objectives, but how do we ensure participants are engaging with the training so that we ourselves can achieve those aims and objectives. And I think given the wider structure of this webinar series around reflecting on the Padova Model UPR to date and where we can go next and what possible elements we can consider redesigning or refocusing, this is something I think that's quite an important point, ensuring full participation in the training from our participants so that they themselves feel that they are able to fully participate with the simulation. And I just wanted to show this breakdown because I'm conscious that not everyone will have a copy of the handbook to hand, but as you can see in terms of the key chapters, looking at the roles of the teams, the various aspects of the assignments that are compulsory in the simulation, and then the processes and procedures such as rules of conduct, formal language and tone and lobbying. The handbook covers them in a chapter format, and that is why our training program as sessions should be designed around that format. It just makes it easier for participants to readily understand the information being provided to them, and then if they need to go and double back, so to speak, and revise something or cover ground once more, if it's modelled on the handbook, it's easier for them to access and learn the information they need in the handbook following that structure. So then if we understand the importance of connecting our training with the aims and objectives so that our participants are prepared for the simulation, firstly, what are the aims? Now, these would just be the aims as identified by myself, but I think firstly, it's really important to think about the key aim as being preparing participants to undertake their roles in the simulation. And then stemming from that, looking more specifically at what we mean by the knowledge and the understanding that should be gained. So the training program really should provide participants with the knowledge and understanding of what we mean by the design of the simulation, and that it's modelled on the UPR mechanism directly, why we have the assignments structured as they are, how does that tie in to what would be the practical realities of the UPR as a mechanism, what their roles and responsibilities will be as participants in the simulation. So understanding if they are a state delegation, what does that mean for the simulation? How is that reflected in the actual UPR? What does that mean in terms of their interaction with teams which are NHRIs, INGOs and other states? And the same for NHRIs and NGOs, understanding their different pathways in the simulation and how that reflects the real world UPR mechanism. Understanding the various assignments in the simulation, but equally why they might slightly differ for each team. And within that as well, also, how do you see assessments as a means of self-reflection on your own performance and evaluating your performance? And then, like I said, more specifically, understanding the connection between the UPR mechanism and the simulation and how the real life structure is reflected in the Padova model. And then lastly, aiming really to develop participants' knowledge and understanding of engaging firstly within their own teams. So understanding how they should be conducting their manner and their performance in such a way that their team reflects their real life organisation or their real life state delegation. And then also how then in their team they can interact and engage with other participants. And that comes back to that sense of community building, relationship building, and hopefully building networks that our participants can take with them after their time with us. And then the objectives, in my opinion, of the training programme really should be tied to very clear and specific learning outcomes. And this is something that I hope with this year's edition, we can really design our training programme around, as I think in previous years, learning outcomes were discussed, but they weren't made perhaps very explicit either within the secretariat or when engaging with participants in the training component. So in my opinion, participants engaging in the training should be able to come away and be able to explain the real UPR mechanism, how it operates and what its impact is within the world of international human rights, to be able to engage and understand with each stage of the Padova model within their formal roles. So occupying those roles and participating as those roles. To understand and complete the required assignments, be they the written components or the oral contributions that I spoke on in the previous week. They should be ultimately able to work in a team structure and undertake management of that team, including around deadlines and timeframes. And I think very importantly, assign teamwork. It shouldn't be a case that one person is carrying their team, or in the bigger teams, 2 or 3 are carrying their teams. The team structure should be recognised as being a way for coordination and organisation where each member has a specific role and contributes to their team's overall performance within the simulation. And then lastly, understanding how to access research materials, resources. That's all falling under that sense of self-directed study and self-directed research. And then how to use those materials and how to cite those materials. So you can see then the academic component, I think, of the simulation in this objective and how the training programme can really help our participants comprehend that. And I think it's something that, whilst we do have it featured within the handbook and we do to date incorporate it within our training programme, I think going forward we can consider how we make that more explicit, particularly when it comes to the written assignments. So ultimately then, how are sessions designed? And as you've probably been able to gain from how I've spoken already, the design and delivery of the training component of simulation will be undertaken by that year's secretariat. And it's usually conducted, the work is conducted around group settings, and it might be formalised smaller teams or more informal arrangements with secretariat members. But whatever way that is structured, there will be groups working on the different components of the training based on their own experiences as past participants, because again, just to emphasise, traditionally our secretariat is either entirely made up or a majority made up of past participants of the Padova Model UPR. And by that I mean, based on their experiences perhaps as a NHRI participant, they will volunteer to help design and deliver the training for the NHRI teams. And it's felt that this is a more appropriate and efficient way of working, firstly given the time constraints the Secretariat will face, as they are still also working on designing and delivering other components of the simulation. So it's best to have people who have the experience and feel confident being able to deliver training, working together in groups, and then under a broader structure of working together to achieve the finalisation of that year's training programme. The design also includes organising and arranging for special events, normally sessions delivered by guest speakers. And we're very fortunate to have a great array of very supportive organisations and past speakers, such as representatives from the UPR Info organisation, but also from the presidency of the Human Rights Council. And that's really important because it really helps our participants see, I suppose, to make the connection between the simulation as an academic and practical learning experience and what is effectively real life human rights practice. And that way we can also have some motivation, I suppose, for our participants in their respective roles, but also ultimately, if they wish to pursue a career in this field, they have the opportunity to learn directly from those working in the field. But it does also mean that the teams designing the training will have input and support from the communications team and secretariat to help liaise with possible guest speakers and finalise their details. And then essentially, just to sum up, what should become very evident is that all those composite roles are incredibly important. So similar to what I'd said previously around evaluation, your team design in delivering the training is incredibly important. You need to ensure that firstly, you work in that cohesive way of people with past experience in their chosen role, working to deliver the training for that chosen role. And then more broadly, the coordination, organisation, communication across those teams and the wider secretariat. That will obviously mean that this planning and preparation for design should take place in a timely fashion, and it should facilitate a lot of discussion, whether it's through formal meetings or it's through shared documents like Google Documents or utilising features in WhatsApp to have ongoing chats. You simply cannot have teams working in silos because, as you can see in my third point, there will need to be agreement around commonality in training. State teams, NHRI teams, and INGO teams will ultimately have to still receive the same training around the broader structure of engagement in and participation in the Padova Model UPR. And it's really important that there is agreement on the key themes, the pillars, I suppose, of the training programme, so that our participants understand not just what their role is, but the role of other teams. As otherwise then there can be confusion, particularly for things like lobbying and alliance building. And addressing that starts with the formation of the teams designing a training programme. So coordination, communication across those teams and the wider secretariat is extremely important in this design pathway. And then finally, the stipulated deadlines. Training design, as I said, needs to be undertaken in advance. Usually it will start in the summer. And I would argue that it shouldn't just be a case of a team going away and saying, I will prepare 3 PowerPoint presentations for 3 sessions. It should be undertaken in steps, identifying smaller tasks and agreeing timeframes and deadlines for those tasks. Because then it means if there are sudden changes around what should be factored into presentations, maybe you wish to have more of a visual element, or you wish to utilise more of a hands-on, practical, interactive component. If the work is broken down to tasks, then we can readily incorporate those ideas or modify those ideas if they were already present. So deadlines and a feasible work plan that's broken into smaller tasks, also very crucial in the design framework of a training programme. And I feel like every week I've talked about reviewing and reflection, but it's so vital. The very first task of the secretariat teams undertaking design and delivery of training for their edition really should do is, as a team, review the previous editions, materials and training programme, review the work of their predecessors in the secretariat, looking at how they designed the preparatory stage so that they use some type of training plan document, that they use a grid, that they have a work plan, how did they structure the tasks and so on, before you even look at what materials they produced. Sometimes you just may wish to directly replicate the previous secretariat's materials with some slight updates and revisions. Alternatively, you may decide that there should be something more radical, so perhaps more, as I said previously, hands-on interactive tasks for participants. So review and reflection of the previous edition is the first step, and tying in with that is the evaluation feedback. So in a previous week, I spoke about how the evaluation form, or whatever means that it's shaped as, will feature some type of aspect of asking participants to talk about training, or maybe identify how their experiences of the training program went. And it's a really useful feedback mechanism, particularly if participants talk about information overload or thinking that the training program needs to be undertaken over a longer period of time with more resources. So the review and reflection component is not just solely about the materials used, it's also how participants use them or felt about them themselves. So really utilize existing resources, but also existing mechanisms like feedback mechanisms when designing a training program of this type. Equally then, it's considering feasibility, considering what type of external support is present. Like I said, we're very fortunate to have a great network of very supportive organisations and individuals to call on to serve as guest speakers. But equally, the Secretariat should think about external resources, how we can highlight existing databases, for example, or websites that feature educational videos, so that we are not feeling that we must completely design from scratch materials which could be found elsewhere. And it also helps participants think about self-directed study and self-directed research to feature that. Then also thinking about the time that's required for this planning phase and this preparatory phase of design. As I said, it's something that should be undertaken in summer, but it's something that requires a number of hours per week. It's not something that could be undertaken in 1 or 2 weeks in the summer. So it's really important when designing perhaps a work plan, thinking about how to spread the work out and who will take lead on organising and overseeing the work being conducted in that time frame. Which leads me into training plans themselves. I'm very much of the favour that a plan should be utilised when designing the training component. In previous years, that hasn't been the case. It's been more of a case of people just working around a laptop and designing the presentation slides. But for myself, just particularly when it comes to organisation and evaluation, I think having a training plan really helps with this, particularly when we're trying to coordinate with other teams in the wider Secretariat on common areas of learning for all the participants. So I say here that a training program or training plan firstly should make clear the general focus of the broader program, but each session of the program. We should be able to identify the aims and the learning outcomes, as well as talk about how that content of the session will be designed and delivered, what format it will take, and then have discussion about utilising videos, for example, or external resources. And I have here with a question mark the idea of tests or assignments. At the minute, there are no requirements for tests to be taken by participants at the close of the training programme. I think at the minute the schedule would make that quite difficult to undertake for the participants to feel that they can revise for it and to sit it when they will have to start thinking about preparing for their written assignments, and for some then travelling to Padova. But I do think there's a conversation to be had about how we can ensure learning is undertaken and participants do feel prepared, that we ourselves are meeting our own learning aims and objectives and the outcomes we've stipulated are being met. And it can also be a very good way for us to evaluate ourselves as instructors, but consider how participants can feel confident and comfortable heading into the on-site simulation. So I leave that there maybe more so as an idea than a very strict recommendation. And then lastly, just to emphasise again, it's so important to utilise the handbook and within the Secretariat, the confirmed rules of the game. And I've called them the thematic sessions. And by that, I mean I'll talk in a later slide, but that sense of if you want a session entirely around assignments, how then can you ensure you're using the handbook to help design and structure that session in a way that will allow participants to open the handbook and follow along with the session and feel that they have the materials and the knowledge that they need to complete those assignments if that's what the session is about. Oh, my slide seems to have frozen. I apologize. There we go. So just to emphasize when I talk about the handbook and the rules of the game, because I know I last spoke about these in depth about 4 weeks ago, the handbook is effectively the simulation blueprint. And as I showed in the slide earlier, it does detail across key chapters the various stages, elements and components of the Padova Model UPR. And the rules of the game go further yet, and they focus on the minutiae of those chapters. So finalizing the processes and procedures of each stage of those elements. So the reason why I'm showing this is to emphasize that the training modules will usually follow some structure similar to this based on what the content is laid out as in the handbook. Some type of introduction to the UPR and then the model UPR, or as I call it, the UPR 101. The second session will probably look at something to do with assignments in detail. And the third session will be structured around more specifically lobbying, engagement and alliance building, which will then be in line with how they are discussed and examined in the handbook. So whilst that can be maybe more specific or slightly changed each year, that's a very general structure, and that again arises from the handbook. And just to show some examples, because again, I'm conscious this is meant to be a more practical based webinar. This is a plan that was taken from my colleagues delivering the INGO training for the Secretariat in 2022. And you can see it was structured firstly with identifying the purpose of the training overall, and then the training specifically per session. And they identified, as you can see here, like the training session number, what it would be called or referred to, when it was taking place. And then they went through slide by slide what the content would look like. For myself, conducting the NHRI training, it was something similar. I had aims, learning objectives, and then looking at the content of each slide. But as you can see here, when I used external resources, I included links because I wanted my colleagues, when we were doing that broader coordination and organisation, to be able to check the resource and think for themselves if they thought it was appropriate. And it also helped with time management, which is a point that's very important and I will look at later. But hopefully this demonstrates how a plan can help organise what content to be covered. And that means then across your sessions, you're not wasting time replicating information, and instead you're focusing on how to tie the sessions together. It also means you can use the handbook as a guide when designing a plan in this way. You can put as much or as little detail in as you want, but it's essentially meant to be a blueprint for yourself when it comes to designing the presentation or whatever means of delivery you feel is appropriate. And what's also important then, this is part of the rules of the game, and this is communicated to participants, is finalising the training agenda and ensuring that that information is circulated, and that it also features within the training programme as a reference point in every session, because not only are we demonstrating to participants what they're covering and what they should be learning from that session, we should be able to convey how each session builds on each other and then features into the simulation in November. So this is what I meant last week when I talked about this idea of evaluation and how we constantly talk about participants, how they should be learning, because how they will be tested on that learning and their performance will be tested in the simulation. Using this type of resource and making reference to it and explaining it hopefully helps in that regard. Now, looking at part 2, delivering the training modules, I firstly really want to emphasize that for me, it's about training delivery. Because As I've tried to emphasize in this presentation, but in previous webinars, the focus is participant-centered learning and skills-based learning. And I think just to say that we are teaching participants does a disservice to the secretariat members who design and deliver the training, and a disservice to the broader concept of the Padova Model UPR, because we really are, by the way that we design and deliver the training component, trying to ensure participants are enhancing their knowledge and understanding of theoretical and academic concepts, yes, but equally that it's practical. They understand they will be gaining a greater use and ability of key skills. So for me, training delivery is a much more appropriate term for that reason, but also because we're thinking about how we are presenting the information participants need to know and the key initiatives and concepts that they need to know. And therefore, for me, it's about the Secretariat realising that they can utilise different learning techniques and processes in delivering the information within the training programme. And again, as part of that review and reflection process, but equally their own internal design process, considering the different ways to present the information in the training programme to our participants, and thinking about what is the best possible learning method for my participants as learners in this training component. So it shouldn't just be about delivering an hour-and-a-half lecture as a secretariat team. It shouldn't be just about reading slides and sending links to participants afterwards. It should be something that's much more focused about the needs of our participants as learners and within the broader context of the learning aims and objectives. And our training, therefore, when being delivered, should always come back to the outcomes. What do we hope our participants learn at every session, as well as the training programme overall? And we can do that by thinking of how we can incorporate different learning forms. So I've talked about this idea of using videos, using interactive exercises, breaking up the continuity of the secretariat members just talking to participants, because again, whilst we want this to be an academic learning experience, it's also something that's meant to be practical and fun and different. And for me then, thinking about that in terms of training delivery means the Secretariat can consider how do we do things differently that our students don't feel they're walking into another university lecture, particularly if they are still trying to understand what it means for them to have a certain role, be part of a certain team, and to get to know the Secretariat and to get to know their fellow participants. So it's something I really want to emphasize. It's training delivery, not just lecturing, not just reading from slides. It's what way are we presenting the information and knowledge our participants need to have? And in addition to that, or arising from that, how are we conveying that they will be enhancing key skills and what those key skills will be, and what's the purposes of the assignment in that context, for example. So it's training delivery for me, and not just necessarily lecturing or teaching. And that then shapes our actual delivery of the programme. So in terms of just, I suppose, the key facts or the key rundown, it can change with every edition, but traditionally the training programme is structured in 3 sessions that, as I alluded to yours earlier, will be designed around those key chapters of the handbook on those key elements of the simulation. They will be delivered online live by Secretariat members. We traditionally have used Zoom, and the Secretariat members should be working as pairs, as instructors. And the training is delivered on the basis of roles. So as I've said earlier, there will be separate training for state teams, NHRIs, INGOs. That can differ every year as part of that internal review, reflection, redesign process. Last year we had 3 separate trainings for those 3 separate roles. The previous year to that, in 2021, it was training for states, and then NHRIs and INGOs were trained collectively. So again, you can see where there is consideration for internal review of the previous edition, but equally, how do we utilise evaluation and feedback from participants and how that can influence the design and delivery of training, which was one of the reasons why we separated it in the Secretariat in 2022. Information will be presented using PowerPoint slides. However, as I alluded to in the previous slide, using different forms and different techniques. So we might have visuals like graphics, some type of spider diagram, tables, the use of color and different fonts, images, but also video materials. And at the minute, the focus is really around, as I said earlier, how we can utilize existing external resources such as the UPR info when we want to use the video components. The training agenda, the slide of which I showed you previously, that was taken from the 2022 training agenda, that will be circulated in advance because our participants will need to know, obviously, when to attend the training, what's required of them from each training session and so on, and how to structure that around their other commitments, their university commitments. At the minute, we don't circulate anything by way of a syllabus that would make this more of a training module. We don't circulate in advance PowerPoint slides. And again, considering the wider theme of this webinar series, and it's something I'll touch on later, I think that's something that internally could be examined. Having said that, and I think this is important for this year's Secretariat, it can be very tempting to want to provide a lot of materials and support to participants, but sometimes participants can feel information overload, especially if they are already receiving different emails about deadlines for assignments, accessing Moodle, advice for traveling to Padova, hotel recommendations, and so on, to then circulate lots of emails with materials and additional materials and resources might actually result in the opposite of what we would want to achieve. And equally, sometimes if you are very kind and you circulate a lot of information, people may not turn up to the actual training program because they think, I have the slides, I have the notes, I don't need to be in person. And it's so important that they are in person attending the Zoom sessions, because it's their chance to get to learn directly and live the key concepts of that session, but also to get to know on a social basis the Secretariat members, other members within their organisational roles, as well as other participants more broadly. So we really need to redirect, as what it comes back to around participant engagement again, redirect our energies around ensuring participants attend the training, but maybe also they can receive more resources afterwards. At the minute, we provide our PowerPoint presentation slides after the session and not before, but again, it's something maybe to be considered. Equally, we have some requirements, and this is because we're trying to convey that sense of the professionalism that's so important for those who will be occupying roles for the on-site simulation. So we try to start this as early as possible to try to reduce maybe some of the tension, or can even be maybe embarrassment about having to carry yourself in a formal way and under a different name. So at the minute, the requirements are quite basic around please ensuring cameras are switched on for the duration of the training, that participants change their Zoom names to reflect their titles. So someone who's from an NHRI of the UK, for example, will say NHRI UK as their username. It's just to help them start to adopt that role and the formality arising with that role, and understanding the tone and diplomatic language that will come with the on-site simulation. And as I alluded to earlier, the training sessions are compulsory, so an attendance is taken. The requirement is for everyone to attend, but in the event there are some, reasons that maybe that's not possible, as long as it's at least one person from an NHRI and INGO team is present, and usually around at least 3 from the States teams are present, so that they can relay information to their colleagues, as well as ensuring their colleagues catch up all materials and so on in their own time. And the structure then, as again, comes back to reviewing and reflecting and redesigning based on previous editions. So it can slightly change, but the, I suppose, foundational focus that we've always used, 3 sessions, 3 days, 3 weeks. And The sessions are usually held mid-afternoon or early evening, because we're cognizant again of participants being students and having their own university commitments. Also the secretariat members usually being students and having their own commitments. But it also just means that being held in that time of the day, there isn't perhaps the pressure to then have to rush off to something else, which means if participants have questions that they wish to put to the secretariat after the formal hour or hour and a half of the training, they can do so, and they can do so maybe in confidence, which is what they prefer. And sessions are usually around an hour and a half duration. That again can slightly change, particularly if the secretariat decide for this specific edition that they want to use a structure whereby one of the sessions is entirely about lobbying. That session then tends to be slightly longer. Last year it was 2 hours long. And that's because of the importance of trying to really explain and articulate the complexity of that, and to incorporate exercises or case studies to really convey the information further. And part of the structure as well is, again, the guest speakers and the special events, and trying to emphasize why that's important in terms of the connection between the theory and the practice. And it's something that last year we also incorporated like a Q&A with the president of the Human Rights Council, which worked very effectively using the forum to gather questions in advance. So it was much more organised compared to inviting such an esteemed guest to an online Zoom session, saying to them that there will be questions for half an hour. And unfortunately, there were no questions forthcoming in 1 year. So again, that shows the importance of reviewing and reflecting on your structure and respecting the time of your guest speaker as well. And we're also very fortunate that guest speakers, as part of the structure of the training programme, usually are very content to allow for us to circulate any material that they use, such as a PowerPoint presentation. So also for us as a secretariat, thinking, how do we circulate that information and ensure that participants have access to it? And that should all really stem from a key point of time management and organisation and advanced planning. As I said earlier, this is something that requires a very active team structure, connecting with the wider secretariat, but within those teams, focusing on the roles themselves to have the coordination, and also as part of the planning, thinking about how you're going to convey to participants the training agenda, advising them of what time that something's being held at, what's expected of them during that session, and so on. And I think part of the planning this year can be about how can we convey to participants about the importance of using the time in front of the secretariat on the Zoom call to ask questions. Traditionally, participants much rather prefer sending emails after sessions, and I think that's totally feasible, that's okay, but it means they're missing the opportunity to ask a question live, so to speak, and sometimes these questions can be answered in 30 seconds. And it also means the secretariat can gauge on the day whether they think there could be a possible issue arising. Could it be a common issue? And then they can set aside time in the next session to address it, and so on. So again, in the context of considering the design of a training programme this year and subsequent years, factoring in participant engagement as part of our planning and the structure of the training programme, I think would be very important. But in terms of the practical aspect of this webinar, the core structure of a training programme session, regardless of the specific content, in my opinion, and I stress this is just my opinion, really should follow this. Having a very clear introduction to your session where you make clear what the topics are to be covered, how it ties in to the overall training programme and the simulation, what the aims of the session will be, and alluding to learning outcomes. Whilst that might sound very classroom based, it just means participants are aware from the beginning what is going to be covered and they can follow along accordingly. And it also means, again, if maybe participants' English is not their first language, it might be a second or third language, it helps the information be more accessible, I think. And it also means if people maybe have to leave early, they're aware of where they have to pick up from. So you want your structure to be clear and accessible, and that starts with the introduction. You also then should follow up with reminders, have a slide reminding participants of key deadlines that are coming up, if they have to start their assignments, to check in if they can access Moodle, because you will be amazed at little prompts, how effective they can be. Last year, for example, we assumed that all participants could access Moodle. There were no Moodle issues. When I incorporated little reminders about how to access Moodle and to contact the Secretariat if you were having difficulties with Moodle, within an hour after that session concluding, I had received about 3 or 4 emails from NHRI teams saying that they could not access Moodle. So it can be a very effective way of engaging with participants and also, again, finding out if there are issues. You then should have some type of structure where, if you know your session is about the introduction to the UPR and the Padova Model UPR, for example, you identify the elements of that. So the UPR specifically, how it's conducted, the Padova Model UPR simulation specifically, how that's conducted. So those are 4 elements. That should therefore mean you separate those elements and you let them build on each other. And then you always link back to relevance. What is the Padova Model UPR in connection to the UPR mechanism itself? And I cannot stress this enough, please only have 1 theme or 1 learning question per slide. It comes back again to accessibility in the structure of your session and wider training program. We really need to avoid information overload, and that means also avoiding word content overload on a PowerPoint presentation slide. If you keep it so that you have 1 theme, 1 learning question, 1 learning aim covered per slide, it's easier for yourself as the instructor to design and deliver it, but it's easier for the participants to actually sit back, reflect on the information, absorb the information, and then if they have questions, knowing how to frame those questions. My key test for this is I might design something and ask a friend who does not have knowledge or understanding of this, read the slide and what do you think it's about? And if they tell me, I think it's about this, 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 then I have to go back and do it, because they should be able to say it's about 1 key thing. So if anything is taken away from this webinar, please structure training programs and sessions in so far as a way that 1 topic is covered per slide. And again, including examples where possible to show the relevancy and the real world application, which is so important. And then with your conclusion, make it very clear that it is a conclusion by summarizing essentially what's been covered in the session, and also providing an overview of what we've always called the next steps. So it might be advising participants of that they have to start working on a certain written assignment, that they have to be mindful of a certain date, that they have to attend a guest session, so start preparing your questions and so on, because again, those wee prompts are so useful for participants, and it's also useful for you as an instructor, because then you can be content that you have reiterated the importance of assignments, how it connects the simulation, and how then it connects into that growth of key skills and learning delivery that I had spoken about earlier. And if I could give any advice or key tips to this year's Secretariat in particular, based on my experience and undertaking this, as well as also just being a teaching assistant more generally, presentations, especially if you are utilising something like PowerPoint, really should be prepared well in advance of the session, not a day or night before. You might want to finalise some sentences the day or night before, but ultimately at least a week and a half in advance. Rehearse it, work as a team, have other members of the Secretariat or even your friends on a Zoom call and practice going over your materials, and time yourself, because there is nothing worse for a participant to be sitting in front of a PowerPoint presentation, having been advised, we will have you here for 1 hour, and realizing actually it's going to become an hour 15 or an hour 20-minute session, because you will lose them and you will lose their focus, and that defeats the purpose of the session. but also it's so good for you as instructors for your own confidence. When you know the material you have to cover in each slide, it firstly sounds a lot more natural. It doesn't sound like you're lecturing someone. It sounds like you're just very enthusiastic about talking about written assignments. But it also means it's much easier for you to answer questions that might come up because you know the material so well. And it also means, as my next point says, you're working as a pair. You can divide slides between your training pair, and you then are aware of the time allocations for each member of that pair. But the reason why I emphasize as a pair work together, please don't, agree to work with someone and not contribute to this. It's so important to have a second pair of eyes when delivering training and designing training. You might miss something that someone else could suggest should be included. Last year, for example, 1 or 2 sessions, we could have worked more effectively as pairs and coordinated across pairs, because what happened was we realized 1 or 2 slides did not have accurate references to that year's handbook. And if we had ensured more greater organization as a pair and working together as pairs, that probably wouldn't have happened, because otherwise what happened was some participants were left confused. So working together isn't just necessarily fairness, so that's really important. It is also about having a second pair of eyes, having someone to check what you've designed and you can check what they have designed. And really important, as weird as it sounds in the concept of training, brand design and ensuring that we have consistency in our branding, our colour, our logo and identity. These are slides that will be accessible to participants. It will be recorded and accessible to participants. And it'll be very jarring to see different colours, different images being used that don't tie in to that year's edition's brand and format. And also just looks much more professional. And we want our participants to feel they are engaging in professional training. And that really assists with that. Again, communicating all requirements to participants in advance. So the usernames and the camera requirements, the importance of showing respect to others. So being kept on mute until you wish to ask a question and so on. But I think this year we could also emphasize more about using the opportunity to ask questions and to raise any issues or suggestions to the Secretariat whilst you have them before you on the Zoom call. And introductions, again, this is part of a socialization of the project, the simulation, right? So ensure that within each session, there's something factored in that ensures, as the Secretariat pair delivering the training, you're introducing yourself, and equally that participants on the call can introduce themselves. And see if you can also factor in something social, like an icebreaker question. It may only take 5 or 6 minutes, but it can really help participants feel more at ease. And when they feel more at ease, they're more likely to engage and then to ask questions or to say they have any concerns. So we want to firstly focus on that social community aspect of the simulation, but also how that has the practical impact for learning and learning delivery. So if an icebreaker game, for example, can help with that, maybe we could think about how to design and deliver that for this year. I've mentioned already the importance of the handbook and ensuring citations and references are accurate and up to date. I cannot emphasize that enough. But I also want to emphasize ensuring that you set aside slides just for space for questions or for breaks. To sit through an hour session or an hour and a half session is already quite daunting, particularly for our participants who may have English as a second or third language, who may have quite unsteady internet connection, or may be commuting, whatever it might be. And if you make it clear that you will have a break halfway through and or will have a break around questions halfway through, it helps participants, I think, maintain that focus and concentration. But then they also know that they're in a space that they can ask questions, that will be actively encouraged. And again, that puts them at ease and can help ensure the training programme is much more well received, but that participants already feel they understand and know the Secretariat as well as other participants. And that really helps when it comes to meeting everyone and starting the simulation in the month of November. And then just because this is a more practical based webinar, I wanted to show some examples of where I think we might have achieved this quite well in previous training program sessions. So when I talked earlier about having a reminder slide last year with the NHRI training, my colleague and I, we called this before we start slide, and we identified that in our training plan where we suggested key points or talked about things that the participants should keep in mind. So there we had the Moodle reminder, communications, staying in contact with the Secretariat and so on. So you can see how that's laid out in the way where it's not information overload, but also we're trying to convey very clearly some key prompts that we felt could help the participants in that session. And this is the idea of one question per slide, and also under that concept of training delivery, thinking about different techniques for learning. So how we could incorporate, for example, videos talking about NHRIs at a very basic level before we talked about NHRIs in the context of the UPR and then subsequently within the Padova Model UPR. So you can see then also that building component. And that was something that I was able to identify and design in my training plan. And this is how it was reflected in sessions. The slide for that particular session. This is probably going to start playing, unfortunately. See if I can skip past that. Yeah. And then also this idea of using prompts. So if you're going to include video materials, thinking about what is it you want to convey to participants that they can learn from that video, that it's not just there to wind down 3 or 4 minutes of the session. So last year I had included this think box, trying to encourage participants to think about the formal language that was being used in this oral contribution from a NHRI. What was the tone that would be used, how their position was articulated, and how their recommendations and suggestions were being conveyed, because that tied in to the assignments as well as that sense of the diplomatic language the NHRI participants would have to use for the simulation, but also helping them understand these were key skills that they would be actively using and learning throughout their time in the simulation directly. I had spoken about that overview of next steps as a concluding slide, and this is just an example of what we used. I would actually say we could have done this better because the text is quite, the same color and not very clear, but at least identifying to start self-directed research, to start thinking about assignments, to familiarize themselves with the train agenda and key speakers and whether or not they could think of questions for the key speakers. And then again, prompting about the use of Moodle, accessing resources available on Moodle, and thinking about how they were going to use it for lobbying and for alliance building. But I think what's also important is, and I'd alluded to this in the overview slide around structure, where I talked about trying to utilize case studies or interactive suggestions or exercises. Last year, we tried to demonstrate for the lobbying session the various aspects of this and the various aspects of alliance building, and we used past participants' materials to convey this. So including, this is an example, a post I would have placed on Moodle when I was a participant in 2021 around possible alliance building. So trying to convey to participants how to use Moodle to that end, how alliance building can be started effectively, but also trying to give them an indication of best practice, getting them to think about how formal language, tone, and diplomatic manner is also conveyed in the written parts of the simulation and not just in the oral contribution or the direct face-to-face lobbying itself. And then following that up with a prompt. So again, it comes back to encouraging participants to be aware of their own active learning. So for that context, I had prompted about what could they notice, what was present in that example that I had given, the language, the tone, how were issues identified, how were they conveyed, so that they could think for themselves what they could take away as a learning opportunity and how that could be applied within their own teamwork in the simulation last year. And something I think we could really expand upon within this year and subsequent years' training programs is trying to have more interactive elements and role play elements. Last year, I tried to incorporate a role play exercise between my colleague and I. So we had one example here. I'll not go into detail, but I had conveyed a specific issue that would be looked at in these two examples and give some context for the participants. And there were two, I suppose, examples. And the aim of the game was for my colleague and I to demonstrate a very good example of lobbying and a very bad example of lobbying. And again, there was the prompt asking participants to think about what was different in those two examples, the language, how it was different. In one example, my colleague and I purposely used really informal language, not at all diplomatic or formal. What were the different approaches? So trying to get them to understand the importance of clarity, summarizing your position, having very clear recommendations that you wish to see adopted, and then asking participants to think what they themselves thought about what was more effective as a lobbying pathway and a lobbying approach. What example was better? And why I say we could deliver this more effectively, I don't think my colleague and I have been able to understand how much time it would take to even explain a demonstration. So some participants weren't quite sure what we were trying to convey, but I think it's definitely something we can maybe feature more this year if we can think about how to plan the time for it. But I do think it's a good way of training delivery insofar as either having the Secretariat act something out or giving these types of examples and prompts to participants and putting them into breakout rooms and encouraging them to adopt the roles, because then it also has the added benefit of helping them get some practical experience of lobbying before the simulation starts. And then finally, and I'm happy to speak about this further as we do have time for questions and discussion, but my reflections then, or thinking about future areas of, I suppose, reflection or redesign for the Padova Model UPR training programme, that idea of the scheduling of the current programme and its duration. We do the 3 days, 3 sessions, 3 weeks. It might be worthwhile to consider if we think we have to have shorter sessions, but more frequent sessions, or how we can rework around what would be the existing academic calendar, or perhaps making use of having 3 live sessions, but recording shorter videos to be watched between those sessions to help with ongoing learning and also ongoing question generation if that's required. I think it might be worthwhile to see if there's time to design a syllabus for the training programme that could be circulated to participants so they know in advance not just what the title of the sessions will be, but what they will learn and what the aims will be and what the materials that can be used will be. As I said earlier, we don't have that in place at the minute. We don't circulate anything like that in place at the minute. And it might be better in terms of helping direct participants and then engage with them if we could have something like this designed and delivered, but then equally thinking about the current workload of the Secretariat and whether there's space for that. I alluded to this earlier, the idea of possibly having some type of short test or learning exercise, could even be a reflection learning exercise and not a formal test at the close of the training programme, as a way of helping the Secretariat see if there's any issues arising or how effective the training was, but equally for participants to think about their own learning experiences and to think for themselves whether they feel fully prepared or if they have questions they would like to ask before they attend the simulation on site. I've mentioned here how we structure sessions on the basis of the roles. I'll not speak too much on that, as I think I've spoken about it in depth in an earlier slide, but this idea of should we have sessions structured solely around the roles and how those roles will have different experiences in the simulation because of course, the real life element of the model, of the UPR mechanism, or whether there should be more inclusion so that participants can know each other quicker and feel that they understand what other teams are doing. It's something I think that could be at least discussed. just to emphasize again, more interactive components. It's a great way to help participants learn because they are actively engaging and actively learning. And it could also help break the ice, so to speak, when it comes to interacting with others, but interacting in that formal role and with the formal language that they will have to do when on site. I've included here learning resources and reading lists. At the minute, we do provide an overview of what we feel are really effective and educational websites within the handbook. And within, it should be session 1 of all training for all the teams. But it's very list-based, it's very text-heavy, and we don't really identify like a prioritization of participants absolutely should look at this and should absolutely look at that. Everything else is more just if they want to, in their own time, read more around a subject. So I think we could think about how we make more explicit the reading material that can be of benefit to participants and how we can incorporate that in what will be the new edition of the handbook. And then I've also had the idea around really utilising existing networks. We have a great network of alumni of the Padova Model UPR, many of whom have either continued to work or undertaken further study in the same spheres that the simulation aims to work in for participants. And I think it might be really interesting to see how we can utilise past participants as instructors or assistant instructors, and tying that in with my suggestion of keeping 3 live sessions but having smaller pre-recorded videos. That's something maybe alumni working in this field or having had a great experience themselves in a certain component of the simulation could record, and that then can maybe help participants see the ongoing impact the simulation can have for them, which ties into the learning experience webinar I previously delivered. We really want participants to realise this is an ongoing learning opportunity. It doesn't just stop after the close of the project in November. And to give them that space to have that reflection, if they could see past participants themselves help deliver training to demonstrate that it's still something that's very much part of their lives. So I'm conscious that it might be great to have some questions or discussions, as we do have members of the Secretariat on the call. So I'll just conclude by saying thank you very much again for listening to the presentation, and not just this week's but previous weeks. And I hope it's been a very useful and worthwhile experience, and I'm happy to take any questions or to see any questions or discussion from those on the call.
Thank you, Leah. I'm afraid my connection from the place where I am is not ideal, so probably it's better if, I don't know, Sophia or someone else takes the lead in, you know, moderating the discussion if there is someone who wants to ask questions to Leah. Thanks.
Yeah, so you have like to raise your hands if you want to ask a question, and I'll give you permission to speak. Or yeah, you can also write in the chat if you cannot speak right now.
Okay, if I may, it's not a question, it's just a comment, and I hope I can go to the end of this comment. What we are organizing, the simulation that we are offering, is not a let's say, traditional form of UN model, because it's a little more sophisticated, if I may. And it also targets students, well, mostly at the master's level, maybe the last year of the bachelor and so on. This means that we expect participants to have maybe not directly an experience in a simulation or in a model UN, etc., but at least a little of experience of skills in how to deliver public speech, how to present effectively their positions, etc. This means that we simply don't train them in this aspect. There are online many materials, tools, videos that can introduce students also from the basic levels on issues like public speaking, how to use effectively your time in a conversation, in a negotiation, in a debate, etc. That we may perhaps encourage the participants to look at. But in our training, we don't focus on these elements. We kind of take it for granted that people can, directly search for such materials in the internet. And our focus is instead on the peculiar characteristics and peculiar aspects of our exercise. The content of the UPR, what is the UPR, what is our game, how the model differs from the real UPR, let's say, and how people can use these regulations to, set a strategy, achieve their objectives as a team, etc.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah, I see Julia, and then Sabaeta also raised her hand.
Yes, I guess my question for Leah was just, since this year we have the extra day on the Monday before the simulation starts, I don't know if you have any ideas or suggestions in terms of how we can incorporate maybe some extra aspects or kind of additional points from the training into that day to make it as successful and as efficient as possible. And also because we kind of decided to have that day for the benefit of participants. So I don't know if you have any opinion on that or general ideas and suggestions.
Thanks so much, Julia. And that is something that I think it's great to see, to have that additional day for the simulation. And I think it would give a really good space to address maybe any final concerns or queries. And I suppose my suggestions would be, think about the opportunity that you have having all participants in person in the space and not just something that's over Zoom. And I know we had spoken about this in a previous webinar, how participants can learn about their own performances based on seeing the body languages or whatever from participants themselves in the room. So maybe it could be worthwhile to think about how we can use that day and the opportunity of being in person and on site to have maybe mock exercises that are based around the skills that will be incorporated, particularly with the oral components like lobbying. So I don't think we could try, given the time both that would be required to design it and then to actually hold it, to replicate lobbying, for example. But I think it might be good to think about how we can use that sense of role play exercises for different topics, so participants get the chance to test out those skills. not necessarily be able to maybe replicate already what they'll be expected to do later in the week, because that is still very much ad hoc. But having team-based skills around speaking, role play, and allowing them to reflect on each other's presentations. I think it would be good also maybe for the Secretariat to consider whether they want to run something around timing of presentations as well, or maybe just giving space for participants who wish to rehearse what they're going to say, the chance to do that, maybe with some of their friends, because that could really help address any last minute fears, I think. So I would suggest thinking about how to use that day in a way that is both a social component, but also focusing on the key skills that underline the tasks and the assignments that will be underway for that week, particularly around lobbying and alliance building, because we all know how fun the lobbying is, but it can be stressful if there are any confusion or issues arising from it.
Sabaita, you can go.
Hello, can you hear me? So first of all, sorry that I cannot open the camera at the moment, but I only had a comment. First of all, thank you very much, Leah. I think your webinar alongside the materials that you have provided from the last year's Secretariat will really make our work easier, and we will try our best to to conduct a training that will keep all of your tips in mind. And especially, I think it's really important to emphasize also, like Julia was mentioning, the social aspect of the training, because as an ex-participant, I remember being a bit distant and a bit hesitant to also interact with other people, which is something that comes also from being in front of a screen, which we have all experienced during COVID lectures. But I think that having some conversation in the beginning, the icebreakers and everything were really, really good tips, and we will really try to incorporate them in our trainings. Thank you very much again.
Thanks so much. And if I can just say, you know, one of the things that I'm so happy about with the work of those who have identified as being as part of the smaller teams to oversee the training this year, it's been so great to see that focus on how can we ensure training is something that's both fun, but also participants feel comfortable to talk to one another and socialize with one another. And I think that's such a good approach to have. And if we can think about how that can be incorporated throughout the training program, it could also mean that, again, participants feel comfortable to ask questions, to work both within their teams and with other teams. And then it means when the simulation itself comes around in November, we can go straight to work, so to speak. People will feel at least more comfortable and confident. And I think it's just about thinking, how do we, as part of our planning and within the plans themselves, include time to have icebreaker games or role play exercises, little things that really help people feel more at ease with each other. And because, as you've said, with the training being delivered on Zoom, it absolutely has its benefits, but that's one of the I suppose the drawbacks. It's one thing to meet in person, and it's something else to meet only on a screen. So I think it's about trying to understand that, yes, it can be a drawback, but there might be possibilities to factor in online games as part of the icebreaker and things like that can really make the program more enjoyable. And if it is more enjoyable, we see the greater engagement, and that's just of great benefit to the participants as they head into the simulation, because they feel more prepared, and then it's easier for the Secretariat to actually deliver the simulation itself, because they know participants feel confident and comfortable going into it. So I think they're excellent comments and observations, and I'm really glad to see that those in the Secretariat this year working on the training already have identified that as a key priority, because I think it's just going to be of such benefit to our participants this year.
Okay, are there any other questions? No?
Okay, so if there is no more questions, I take this last minute to thank very wholeheartedly Leah for this series. she had with us. I think we have a lot of materials from her, both in terms of video that we can use, I hope, effectively, also for our trainings, by the way, and also the captions of what you said. I hope then can be downloaded, adapted, maybe with your support, Leah, and they would definitely be used to integrate the handbook in the site of the new edition that we want to have of it, maybe by the end of this year. So thanks a lot for everything. I hope we can meet you and see you in Padova, maybe on the occasion of this simulation. I really hope you can manage to come eventually physically to our town and see how things take shape in the real world. Okay, thank you a lot again. Thanks to all who participated in this series. Thanks to Sophia, Julia, and the other members of the Secretariat who have attended these meetings. And well, have a nice holidays and summer. See you soon in September with the new, important phases of this model UPR, which are ahead in the coming months.